Well, I love that we're a superpower. I love that because I really do believe that, when you look at the history of Western civilization, I love the idea of an empire. I love the idea of the Roman Empire, the Spanish Empire, British Empire. And I love the idea that we just have this crazy productive capacity, huge population, huge resources. I like the power of America. That's something I've really been liking a lot lately.
Nick Fuentes recently went on Steven Crowder's show and promoted the idea of an American empire. And in this clip, he gets into the question of, well, does this conflict in some way with Nick's mentality toward decoupling the United States from Israel, something we often promote on this channel? And what does that mean? Is there any shortcomings to this sort of foreign policy orientation? Let's get it from him. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Even if we disagree with your views, like I told Ben Shapiro in 2016, 2017, I don't think we should be giving any money to Israel. Now, unlike you, I support them over Hamas morally, but I think we should stop funding all sides of the war in the Middle East. And hopefully you find that a reasonable position, whether you agree with it or not. I don't think that's extreme. And Ben didn't seem all too bothered by it. But I also invited him to be on the show, and he was going to, and he disappeared. But I just saw him on with Don Lemon and David Pakman. So I guess they're not so abhorrent.
That's interesting. So he agreed to come on, but then he canceled?
Yeah, it was just sort of informal, by text. And then I just haven't heard back from him. He's been on the show many times. So I'll give you credit, Nick. Candace, Tucker, Ben, Mark, everyone invited on. You're the only one with the balls to show up. I have to give you kudos for that.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate, even though you didn't call me out, I saw the clip.
Well,
I was like, where's my call out?
I knew you would show up. You're like the candy. You're like the candy man. I say your name 3 times in the camera, you'll show up. No, but we did reach out. I said we didn't want to because we didn't want it to be a conflict. We had already communicated, or my producer had, and I didn't want to call you out as though you were ducking. Those other people have been ducking.
Oh yeah, totally fine. No, and I'm here, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. And I think we agree on. Maybe this is going to sound like I'm kissing your ass a little bit, but I do always feel like you were less bad than all the other people in the conservative movement.
That's high praise.
Well, and
that does kind of come off as kissing his ass, but it is true in terms of foreign policy to some extent. I have my issues with Crowder, certainly on Israel. And I'm kind of alarmed how he snuck that quip in there. Like, unlike you, I support Israel over Hamas. I don't think I've ever heard Nick say, I support Hamas. I've heard Nick say that we should disassociate from Israel entirely. It's not productive for the U.S. It's not America first. And that we shouldn't defend any aspect of this genocide. And that's a different story from saying, oh, I support Hamas, which is something that nearly no American clings to as a reasoning for this. That's just Zionist propaganda that people say that you're defending Hamas. No, not whatsoever. And that's the same propaganda they use to say, hey, if you don't want a proxy war versus a nuclear power in Russia, you must be pro-Putin. Or if you didn't want to invade Iraq, you must have been pro-Saddam. Oh, you don't want a 20-plus year occupation of Afghanistan? You must be in the bag for Al-Qaeda. They do this every single time. It's just war propaganda. I'm a little surprised Nick didn't push back, but they do seem to have a much better vibe than many of Nick's other podcast hosts that have had him on.
America first. I identify as a conservative, as a nationalist. I wear that since it became a pejorative. Like, I thought that was sort of a default thing for America. So you wouldn't hear me saying nationalist until people were like, nationalist means you're a supremacist. I'm like, well, okay, well then I'm a nationalist. Now I have to claim it because of course I want America to do best. Since you, I know, are very clearly America first, let me ask you, what do you love most about America?
Well, I love that we're a superpower. I love that because I really do believe that, when you look at the history of Western civilization, I love the idea of an empire. I love the idea of the Roman Empire, the Spanish Empire, British Empire. And I love the idea that we just have this crazy productive capacity, huge population, huge resources. I like the power of America. That's something I've really been liking a lot lately.
Okay.
Interesting. I mean, being a superpower, if you want to prolong that status, requires everything that the United States is not doing. And Nick doesn't promote all those things. He certainly doesn't promote the attachment to Israel, the proxy war versus Russia to some extent. But I don't know that that's principled. Nick has also said that he wants those resources taken away and being built up in the Asian Pacific for a future showdown with China. He also has supported on record, on video, the regime change effort in Venezuela, which Trump tried to consummate in his first term by replacing Maduro with Juan Guaido, if you remember that, and now is flirting with bombing Maduro again, possibly trying to negotiate with him to step down, but telling the press corps that, Maduro offered him everything, but he's not going to take it. It does seem like the Rubios and the neocons want war here. Look, American empire, if you want that, it necessarily involves insane amounts of debt, insane entangling alliances, insane inflation to bankroll it with the central bank printing fiat to cover it. It's why something like half the dollars that have been printed in U.S. history have been printed in the last decade to finance it. It's why our debt payments are more than the Pentagon's budget at this point, and why defaulting seems like the only option in some regards, because it's just not sustainable. And the U.S. totally squandered the unipolar moment. So if you want empire, you have to take all the negative ramifications that come with it. That's the evidence from history shows that and demonstrates that, many of which Nick complains about the debt, about, terrible U.S. foreign policy and maintaining an empire in the Middle East. What do you think creates that empire? It is the attachment to Israel. So no, beholden to empire is the biggest disaster in U.S. history. It's something that the founders completely, pooped all over, so to speak, if I'm to be particularly eloquent about that. Even those that disagreed with each other. We have Jefferson and Washington saying that this is just going to be a disaster, and just the entangling alliances are just going to be impossible to accept and impossible to allow for the preservation of the type of virtuous constitutional republic we want.
And of course, we don't want to take that for granted. Obviously, the power of America, that switches in a nanosecond as far as history. Is there anything else that stands out to you aside from the power? I mean, if not, we can move on to the next.
Yeah, I love political liberty. I like the Constitution. I like our culture. I like that we're like a pan-European empire. I like that, because when you compare us to Europe, you look at Europe and it's sort of petty and small, and they're squabbling and they're fighting, between these little towns and villages. And I like that there's just this sense of nationhood in America between European Christian people and other people too, of course. But for the most of our history, it was mostly the Europeans. But,
yeah.
But if you like history, you like liberty, you like the Constitution, it's completely antithetical to American empire. Article 1, Section 8, the enumerated powers, doesn't give the United States license to launch all these foreign wars, military operations. It doesn't license us to even give foreign aid unless it's part of a treaty under Article 2. It doesn't allow the U.S. to build something like 800 bases worldwide. So I don't think you can have both, that you want the American empire and want to adhere to the Constitution that in many ways rejected empire, and the foreign policy of the United States for about a century was the Monroe Doctrine, and not getting embroiled in the European affairs whatsoever. And this stood mostly to generate peace and prosperity in the United States without an empire, way before the U.S. created an empire. So I don't think that the liberty and the Constitution are in any way compatible with empire, and the founders knew that completely because of the Roman experiment, because of Alexander the Great's empire, because of the Mongols, etc.
There's a lot of things I like about America.
Yeah, that's where I would already disagree with you, because I was raised in Quebec, which is much more European, and I think
True.
Europe kind of sucks. I'm not a big...
Why?
Well, because there's far less freedom. In Quebec and a lot of these European nations, they had an enforced denominational form of Christianity, which didn't work out. That breeds atheism. I believe that Quebec is possibly the most unchurched population in the industrialized or Western world, even though Catholicism was a state-enforced, provincially enforced denomination. I think we're better than Europe. That's why we left. But I do understand that the founders, obviously, were largely white Christian European. Protestant, obviously. I know you and I, we'll quibble about that, but that
Sure.
is the basis here.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that Catholics aren't welcome. But let me ask you, what about the founding, like founding fathers? Is that something? Because I know you have you have opinions kind of on both sides of that, and I think they're more nuanced. But is that a big part of what you like?
I love the founding fathers. I think they're brilliant. I love George Washington. I love Hamilton. I like John Adams. I think they're remarkable people. So yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Again, seems incompatible with the idea of empire. Even Hamilton and Washington. Hamilton helped draft Washington's farewell address, which when delivered said, we have to do whatever we can to avoid foreign attachments. And foreign entanglements will be the undoing of America, and that is what American empire is doing. I'm glad Nick thinks that. But even the Hamiltons of the world that wanted the biggest possible American government, he was an American nationalist before the idea was concocted, and it's all relative to his time, right? Even Hamilton didn't have the prospect of creating an American empire whatsoever. So this is an interesting disconnect too.
Political liberty. Can you kind of explain, I guess, that a little bit? Because that's where I know you said you've said that you differ with conservatives. And I don't want to mischaracterize you. I understand you've said that you're not, quote unquote, conservative. That's not you
Right.
identify as America first. So political liberty, what does that mean?
I would say I'm more reactionary than conservative. That's why I don't mean when I say I'm not conservative that I'm something else. And so, you know, as far as political liberty goes, I like that in our country, we have a generally permissive climate. I think, of course, that's gone too far in some ways. But I do like that we have a free press. I like that we have the right to own guns. I am a capitalist. I'm not an ideological free market person, but I like that we have private property. I like we can own what we earn. And on some level, I like that we have a republic. I'm very into the idea that we have Republican sovereignty. That we have rights. They're protected by God. The Constitution respects that also. Okay. And I would say, because I could kind of see maybe, I don't know if you're comfortable with this, if I could go a little further here.
Sure. I mean, go wherever you want. And as long as you're comfortable with me disagreeing and understanding that it's...
All right, we'll check on that in a second. So a lot of what Nick said there, I totally agree with. I like how there's a generally free press. I mean, that seems to be more and more stomped upon by various sectors of the government, especially when it comes to criticism toward Israel. It doesn't exactly mean you have a free press when U.S. disaster relief gets held back if you're part of an organization that criticizes Israel. That story broke a long time ago. We also know, due to the Twitter files and things like that, that every three-letter agency under the sun was trying to work with these social media platforms and make them essentially its appendages to censor Americans, ban their users from the platforms. That's what the Twitter files revelations show. Now, those precedents stand, even though it seems like maybe some of those campaigns have died down in the last year or two. Maybe that's the case, but there's nothing stopping that power from continuing under an administration that wants to pursue it. I'm not making any judgment calls, but I do think this administration hasn't pursued, trying to strong-arm big tech to doing that as much as, say, the previous administration. But it doesn't mean they can't. And there sure is a focus on trying to defend the Hasbara narrative in every single direction. At the same time, yeah, Americans can own guns. That's great. There's too many infringements on that, for sure, with the ATF making rules through a bureaucracy to prevent even people from buying parts kits to assemble into guns. That's part of the self-made tradition of the United States, too, though. And Nick is not a capitalist. He might say that, but in this very interview, he defended New Deal public works projects, trade embargoes, centrally planned economics, etc., and much more centrally planned economics than he purports here. He's not a capitalist, and if you doubt that, let's just watch another segment of this interview.
We might need a very powerful executive for a short amount of time. I think that's maybe unavoidable.
Okay.
But not an ideological totalitarian state, no.
So how do you get to that in the industrialization that you talk about with Stalin? How do you get it? How do you get there?
I think that you need tariffs. I think you need subsidies. I think you need a massive public works program, something like the New Deal. And I know you're probably not a fan of that because I know you're a huge free market guy, but I think that one of the things the free market doesn't do well is it doesn't allocate resources efficiently on like a long-term timeline. You know, in a long-term timeline, America needs to have a ton of industry to be able to support its Navy, to be able to protect supply chains and trade routes. And the free market has not been able to accomplish that. So I think that the government needs to intervene in this case.
Okay, so you got enough of that, but he's clearly not a capitalist. He believes in centrally planned economics. Say whatever you want about capitalism versus socialism, etc. You know, a lot of Marxists don't even define that term, capitalism, the same way that capitalists would. Marx thought that, you know, tariffs were part of capitalism. Marx thought that corporate welfare was part of capitalism, but really to adherents of capitalism that promote the idea, those two things are incompatible with capitalism, where capitalism is just the free exchange of goods and services between peoples. And public works projects that are centrally planned are not consensual free exchanges. They exist only because government bureaucrats wish them into existence. They might be authenticated by an executive putting them into force. Neither have subsidies. Subsidies are not capitalism. These are impediments to free trade and voluntary trade. Again, say whatever you want about capitalism, but Nick isn't a capitalist. He's more or less a national socialist than he is a capitalist, and he says that same thing in this interview.
It's meant to be fair, but I'll let you know where I do.
Yeah, because maybe I could see where you're going with this. You know, I'm really not like a totalitarian. I don't want a police state, you know, to the extent that people say these things about me, like you're a fascist, you're a communist, or a socialist. I'm very much not in favor of that sort of thing. I just think that, you know, in the past 30 years, we've gone a little bit too far in the other direction. That's all.
No.
Well, you just did promote public works projects and subsidies, and other places on your channel you promote, you know, expanding the welfare state. That is socialist. I'm sorry to say that. You wouldn't necessarily say that's complete communism, as Marx saw socialism as just one rung on the progression toward outright socialism, outright communism, I should say. But at the same time, you promote those same ideas. This is really no different than what Bernie Sanders proposes. It really isn't. You just put a Nick Fuentes mask on Bernie Sanders' preferences toward economics. That's literally what this is.
And I wouldn't disagree with that last part, by the way. For example, I think it's very reasonable to say, you know what, maybe OnlyFans isn't a good thing. When you have libertarians going, oh yeah, if they ask for identification to prove you're of age to get pornography, the next thing you know, they're going to take your guns away. I'm like, yeah, I think that being 18 to get hardcore pornography kind of makes sense.
To be clear, I don't know a single libertarian that argues against that. They might exist. They might exist in niche, but I'm fine with 18 years old to get access to hardcore pornography. I don't want to adjust that. I'm a libertarian. I know very few libertarians that make this a centerpiece of their ideology, but maybe there are some. Just like there are horrible Republicans that make mass murdering civilians in Gaza part of their platform. That certainly is the case.
So if addressing the hardcore libertarian sort of ideology, I would agree. If it goes towards like a theocracy or something like that, which I know you've discussed, I would disagree.
Yeah, theocracy is a horrible prospect. I don't think it's fair to say that Nick has authenticated that or endorsed that in any serious way. He has called for, you know, a Christian country. He doesn't think it should be subsidizing Catholics only or anything like that. And I think they actually do talk about that more in this interview. But yeah, theocracy is backwards. And you know, one of the arguments that Jefferson and Madison made in the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, it's actually the model legislation drafted by Jefferson in the 70s and eventually gotten passed through the Virginia Commonwealth in the 1780s. It said that, you know, God made the mind free. And because God made the mind free, people have right of conscience and shouldn't be forced into subsidizing any established religion. And there were lots of established religions in the American colonies and then American states. In fact, Massachusetts didn't even break its connection to the Congregationalist establishment, the established church that was in Massachusetts, until 1833. So this existed in some American states for a long time, but they said that, You know, it's actually a slap in the face to the creator to say that he would need government to compel people to fund his ministry, to fund his church. And that's why Virginia ultimately disconnected its association with the Anglican Church there in, I believe, 1786. So that's what you have here. But look, Nick promotes empire, and there's nothing more warped than American empire. That's what the entire last 2 decades shows. From 9/11 forward, the United States has squandered so much wealth in these empire-building projects, and that is the natural result of these projects is immense debt, immense bloodshed, 5 million people being killed in the overall war on terror. You have this proxy war in Ukraine where probably 1 million Ukrainians have died in that. In Gaza, over 100,000 people dead in Gaza, with even Israel admitting from a leaked database, and this story was covered by Guardian, 927 magazine, etc., were 83% civilians that weren't Islamic Jihad or weren't Hamas. This is a leaked database from an Israeli source showing that. You have all the inflation this causes, you have the displacement of peoples, you have thousands of American troops killed over there, and then you have 30,000 U.S. troops that were veterans of the war on terror offing themselves because what they saw, it's just unacceptable. I don't like the idea of an American empire. Don't like the idea of theocracy, though that's not completely what Nick promotes. Some of the things he said about censorship and gun ownership, I'm totally on board with. But in so many ways, you can't both say that I want, you know, this empire building scheme in the Middle East unwoven by disconnecting from Israel, which Nick does argue, and I agree with him totally on that. But I love the idea of American empire. That is part of the empire. The Middle Eastern empire building scheme that involved the toppling of Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi and Assad in favor of Al-Qaeda, by the way, in Syria. And all these different death traps for Americans are part of the American empire building scheme. So is war with Iran, which Nick opposes too, rightfully so. I agree with him on that. But this is the fruits of empire. That's what you get. The Eastern Wing is concerned with empire building against China and Russia, and a proxy war right now with Russia. Some conservatives would trade that for a proxy war with China over Taiwan, you know, learning nothing from the disaster that is that charade. And that's probably putting it lightly. It's also a death machine. So take it as you will. An empire is a bad prospect for the United States. Basically, all the founders agreed, whatever merits they have or don't. It's something that they largely thought was just impossible for America to sustain its liberty, to sustain its virtue alongside empire building. And we're seeing that. Nothing has been more prophetic than that. Say what you want about the founders, too. A lot of shortcomings. All men have shortcomings, right? But they were totally right on that, for all the reasons they said. And Madison said that war in many ways contains the germ of every other calamity. And that's so true, because what we've seen from war is attacks on civil liberties. We get the Patriot Act and the surveillance state and the DHS and the debt and inflation that comes along with it. But what do you guys think? Is Nick right? Should we have an American empire? Is this one of Nick's worst takes, as I think it is? Let me know in the comments down below. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel. Also subscribe to Steven Crowder. Thanks for this interview. Not a huge fan of Crowder, but I thought the interview was actually interesting and raised some interesting points and pushback toward Nick, which is great. And if you like this video, please consider becoming a YouTube member. You can do that by clicking the join button below. And if you do that, I'll give you access to all my videos before they go live to the general public on YouTube. You'll be able to see those members only videos right away. And also, if you want a free copy of my first book, Compact of the Republic, click the link in the description below. And you'll just go off to a site, plug in your email, and I'll send that to you in PDF form, free of charge, no obligation, just because I appreciate you watching. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.